My name is Maya Whitaker. I'm 32. I spend most mornings planning meals for people old enough to be forgotten by their own children. That Friday started with oatmeal, medication charts, and the smell of weak coffee. It was in the dining room of the senior center where I worked in Cedar Rapids. I was checking the breakfast trays. My phone lit up on the stainless steel counter. My mother. We left your grandmother dinner. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. I read it twice. Not happy birthday. Not can you check on her. Not even we're sorry we couldn't stay. Just that. By 10:06, the family group chat was full of photos from Santa Fe. My sister Tessa in a cream linen dress, standing under a banner that said warmth, wellness, and modern aging. My father gave the camera a thumbs up. My mother wore the smile she saved for donors and strangers. It was my grandmother Evelyn's 86th birthday. I drove 47 miles to Maple Junction. My hands were tight on the wheel. The house behind the old Willow Spoon Cafe looked the same from the road: white siding, blue back door, porch light still on even though it was noon. Grandma was sitting at the kitchen table in her good cardigan, the pale yellow one with pearl buttons. In front of her sat a frozen turkey dinner, still sealed, still cold in the middle. A tiny birthday cake from the grocery bakery waited beside it, untouched. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They said it's safer this way," she said. I looked down at the label on the plastic tray. SilverTray Senior Nutrition Trial Meal, 1 of 14. That was when I stopped thinking they had forgotten her birthday. Because forgetting happens once. This had a schedule. Here is a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. All right, enough talking, let's begin the story. I didn't touch the tray right away. My eyes stayed on the label, then moved past it to the refrigerator, where Grandma kept a paper calendar under a tomato-shaped magnet. I had seen that calendar 100 times and never really read it. That day I did. The little squares were filled with names and notes. Cal soft bread. June low salt. Mildred no onions. Walter check porch light. At first, I thought they were reminders to call people from church. But every name had a day. Every day had a meal. "Grandma," I asked, keeping my voice careful, "what is this?" She followed my eyes to the calendar and gave one of those small shrugs older women use when they are trying to make a burden look like a hobby. "Just a few folks," she said. "Nothing worth fussing over." That was my grandmother. She could feed 6 people, remember who couldn't chew crust, who got lonely after dark, who needed less salt, and still call it nothing. I was beginning to understand how much of her life had been hidden inside that word. The old wall phone rang before I could ask more. Not her cell phone, the beige one beside the pantry with the curled cord stretched thin from decades of being pulled toward the stove. Grandma looked at it, then at me. "Would you get that, honey?" I picked up. A man's voice came through, low and embarrassed. "Evie, it's Cal. I hate to bother you, but June said maybe soup wasn't coming tonight." He paused. "Tell her not to worry. I can do toast. It's just that SilverTray thing came, and the bread was hard as a roofing shingle." I looked back at Grandma. She had turned toward the window, but I could see her face reflected in the glass. "Calvin Mercer's dentures don't fit right," she whispered, like that was not a detail but a responsibility. I told Cal we would call him back, then hung up gently. When I opened the refrigerator, I found 6 glass containers stacked in careful rows, each one marked with blue painter's tape. Cal, June, Mildred, Walter, Ruth Ann, Mr. Pike. Soup in 2, chicken and rice in another, something soft and pale for Cal. "These aren't leftovers," I said. Grandma sat a little straighter, as if I had caught her doing something wrong. "No," she said. "They're supper." I looked at the insulated bags by the back door, the ones I had always assumed were for groceries. Inside were plastic spoons, napkins, salt-free crackers, and a roll of labels. Not one bag had Grandma's name on it. She had been left with a cold tray on her birthday. While her own kitchen was ready to feed half a dozen people, nobody else remembered well enough to feed properly. I warmed a small bowl of soup first, just enough for Grandma. It was the only thing in that kitchen that made sense. She sat at the table with her hands folded beside the SilverTray meal, watching me move around her stove like she was afraid I might stop and ask the question she had been avoiding. The old pot was heavier than I remembered. It had a dent near the handle from the year I dropped it at 13, and Grandma had laughed and said, "A pot with no dents never fed anybody interesting." The smell filled the room slowly. Chicken, thyme, celery, the kind of warmth that made the windows fog at the edges. I set the bowl in front of her, and she took one spoonful like she was tasting proof that the day had not been completely ruined. I had barely put the spoon down when my phone started buzzing across the counter. Video call. My mother. I almost ignored it, but Grandma saw the name and said, "Answer. Let them see I'm eating." Santa Fe flashed onto the screen in bright colors. My sister Tessa stood behind my mother in a cream linen dress, under a clean white banner that read, "Warmth, Wellness, and Modern Aging." My father leaned into the frame, already annoyed. My mother looked past me at the stove. "Maya, why are you cooking?" I kept the phone steady. "Because Grandma was hungry." She blinked like I had missed the point. "We left dinner." I looked at the tray on the table. "You left a trial meal she didn't ask for." My father's jaw tightened. "Don't start. We're trying to help her transition." "Transition to what?" I asked. "Eating alone from a tray?" Tessa stepped closer, smiling the way she did when a camera was nearby, even if the conversation was ugly. "SilverTray is actually beautiful, Maya. Grant says older people do better with structure." Grandma set her spoon down. "I have structure." Dad exhaled. "Mom, you are 86 years old. You should not be cooking for half the block." "I cook for 6 people," she said. "That's how it starts," he replied. Something in the room changed. Not loudly. Just a small click inside me, like a cabinet door finally shutting. "Why does the label say 1 of 14? I asked. My mother went still. Behind her, Tessa looked away. "There's a board review Monday," Mom said carefully. "For the senior meal grant, we need to show your grandmother can accept help." Grandma looked down at her soup, and for the first time all day, I saw embarrassment cross her face. Her own children had turned her birthday into evidence. When the call ended, she pushed back her chair and opened the refrigerator. "If they want proof," she said. 6 people still have to eat tonight." Grandma packed the first bag with both hands. She did it slowly, like each container had to sit in the right spot, or the person getting it would notice. Cal's soup went in front, wrapped in a dish towel to hold the heat. June's chicken and rice went beside it, with a note that said, "Easy on the broth." Mildred's container had blue tape across the lid, with 3 words written darker than the rest. "No onions, ever." I watched Grandma check each one twice, and I understood this was not stubbornness. It was memory made practical. I drove her old Buick. Grandma sat beside me with one hand on the first insulated bag. The November air had gone sharp, and the porch light clicked on behind us as we pulled away. Through the kitchen window, I could still see the SilverTray box sitting on the table, its plastic lid shining under the light. The food Grandma made left the house in glass containers with real names on them. The food my family called safer sat behind us in a tray that did not know who it was for. Cal lived 4 blocks away in a small ranch house with a flag faded almost white. He opened the door before we knocked, wearing slippers and a flannel shirt buttoned wrong. "Evie," he said, then saw me and straightened. Grandma handed him the soup like it was nothing special. He took it with both hands. "Bread soft?" he asked, embarrassed by the question. "Soft enough," Grandma said. "And I put the crackers separate so they won't get soggy." His face did something I knew from work, relief trying not to look like need. At June's apartment, the hallway smelled like laundry soap and old carpet. June was 77, small, with silver hair pinned too tightly and a walker parked by the recliner. She thanked Grandma for the chicken and rice, then nodded toward the trash can beside the counter. I saw the corner of a SilverTray sleeve sticking out. I tried it, June said, before anyone asked. It said low sodium, but I woke up twice for water. She laughed softly, as if saying sorry to her own tired throat. Grandma touched her arm. "You're not difficult," she said. "You're thirsty." Mildred lived next door to a family with 3 kids and a basketball hoop. She opened the door with the television loud behind her and said, "If there's onion in that, I'm haunting both of you." Grandma smiled for the first time that night. "No onions," she said. "I checked the broth too." Mildred pointed at me. She remembers because I told her once in 1998, and she never let me forget it. I almost laughed, but then the laugh stuck half in my throat. The people closest to Grandma had missed what strangers trusted her to remember. Walter was last. He did not ask what was in the container. He asked whether Grandma had noticed the porch light flickering 2 houses down. The woman there lived alone and might need someone to check the bulb. Grandma told him she had noticed. Of course she had. On the drive back, she sat quiet, hands folded over her purse. I wanted to ask why she had been doing this alone. That sounded too much like blame. So I asked, "How long?" She looked out at the dark storefronts and said, "Long enough that your father decided it was a problem." Back at the house, the kitchen had cooled. Grandma reached under the passenger seat before I could help her out. She lifted a thin notebook with a soft, worn cover. The corners were bent, the pages swollen from steam and years. She held it against her chest for a moment, like a child caught with something fragile. "Your father thinks if a thing isn't on paper, it doesn't count," she said. Then she put the notebook in my hands. So I started writing it down. I read the first pages of Grandma's notebook that night, at her kitchen table, under the yellow light above the stove. It was not a recipe book. There were no measurements, no oven temperatures, no little notes about butter or crust. It was names, dates, small warnings, and things people only remember when they have paid attention for years. Cal did not eat beef near the anniversary of his wife's death. June needed a call before Thanksgiving. Mildred could not have onion powder, not even a little. Walter said he was fine when his porch light was out, which meant he was not fine at all. Grandma watched me read, like she was waiting to be corrected. I turned another page, and found notes from the previous winter. Who needed early delivery before snow, who could not open jars anymore, who had a daughter who only called on Sundays. My family had called this a habit, a problem, a risk. But with those pages under my palms, it felt less like a hobby and more like a map of who was alone. Grandma slid the notebook closer to me. "You understand food rules," she said. "Tell me where I'm wrong." The next morning, I kept the notebook zipped in my bag, not to show anyone. Grandma had asked me to help her see where her system might be unsafe. I was halfway through checking breakfast trays at the senior center when Nora Bellamy appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had run that place for 19 years, and her calm face usually meant something had already gone wrong. "Maya," she said, "can you step into my office?" On her desk was a printed email. Before I sat down, I saw the phrase "unregulated meals." Nora folded her hands. "I don't believe this is what it's trying to make it sound like," she said, "but because you work here, I have to ask." The sender was Deirdre Voss, consultant for SilverTray Senior Nutrition. The email raised concerns about an elderly resident distributing food to vulnerable seniors. It said she might have been encouraged by a family member employed in elder care. They had not named me, but they had drawn a chalk outline around my job. Nora's voice softened. "Tell me what's happening." I told her the truth without giving private details that weren't mine to give. I said Grandma cooked for a few neighbors. I said I had only learned how organized it was the night before. I said no one had gotten sick, and the people receiving meals were adults who asked for them. Before Nora could respond, my phone buzzed. "Dad." I stepped into the hallway and answered. He did not say hello. This is what happens when you romanticize old habits. I looked back through the office glass at Nora, still holding that email. "You reported her?" I asked. "I protected her before someone got sick," he said. His voice had that steady business tone he used when he wanted cruelty to sound like policy. "You left her food she couldn't even chew," I said. He sighed. "This is bigger than your feelings, Maya." After he hung up, Mom's text came in. "If you love your grandmother, stop helping her pretend she's still running a diner." That was the trick they always used. They did not say I cared too little. They said I cared the wrong way. When I got back to Grandma's that afternoon, she was sitting with the notebook open, pen in hand, but nothing new written down. "If they make this official," she said quietly, "they won't let me cook anymore." Grandma's fear stayed in the room after she said it. It sat between us, heavier than the notebook, heavier than the pot cooling on the stove. I wanted to tell her nobody could stop her from doing something kind, but I worked in elder care. I knew kindness did not protect you from forms, complaints, liability language, or people who used the word safety like a locked door. So instead of promising what I could not promise, I pulled out a chair, sat beside her, and opened the notebook again. We went through the pages slowly, not to defend her, but to understand what she had built. The notes were not random. They showed patterns. Who needed food before dark? Who stopped answering the phone when the weather turned bad? Who said they were fine because it felt safer to ask for less than to ask for help? Grandma read them like the people were sitting right there with us. I saw then that I had been asking the wrong question. It was not whether her system could survive scrutiny. It was whether anyone had bothered to understand what it actually did. Then my phone buzzed with a voice message from Tessa. Her name still had the little sparkle emoji she added years ago when she borrowed my phone and never changed it back. I pressed play, expecting some careful excuse from Santa Fe. Instead, Tessa's voice came in mid-sentence, low and tense. "But that's my grandmother." Then Grant, smooth and calm behind her, said, "The board needs a clean story. Unsafe volunteer cooking versus modern senior nutrition. Keep it simple. If Evelyn matters to them, make her the reason this has to change." The message disappeared 3 minutes later. She had deleted it. I sat there holding a blank screen, and a sentence I could not unhear. For one sharp second, I wanted to use it. I wanted to call Nora, call the board, call anyone who would listen. Tell them Grant was turning Grandma into a problem on purpose, but Grandma looked at the notebook, then at me, and asked quietly, "Are you trying to help me, Maya, or are you trying to beat them?" That question took the heat out of my anger. Not because I was wrong to be angry, but because she was right about the danger inside it. I had been so busy protecting Grandma from people deciding for her that I nearly became one more person deciding without asking her. I put my phone face down and asked the question I should have asked first. "Grandma, what do you actually want?" She looked tired, but not confused, not fragile, just old in the honest way, with a spine that had carried too much for too long. "I want them to stop deciding whether I'm useful," she said. I did not call a lawyer. I did not start a family war in the group chat. I called Nora, because she understood two things my family kept pretending were opposites: food safety and loneliness. When she answered, I said, "I need you to look at something with us, not to shut Grandma down, to figure out what help would look like if anyone asked her first." There was a pause, then Nora said, "Bring the notebook back tomorrow, if Evelyn agrees." Grandma closed her eyes when she heard that. For the first time all day, her hands stopped shaking. Nora came the next morning in jeans and a navy cardigan, carrying a clipboard she never opened. That mattered to Grandma. People had been looking at her like a problem for 2 days. Nora was the first person who sat at the kitchen table before asking a single question. She listened while Grandma explained the routes, the notes, the allergies. She heard about people who stopped answering phones when they felt ashamed of needing help. Then Nora closed the notebook gently and said, "Evelyn, I need to be honest with you. If the complaint becomes formal, they may ask you to pause deliveries until Monday's board review." Grandma nodded once, like she had expected the blow but still felt it land. "Pause," she repeated. Nora's face tightened. "That is the word they'll use." We all knew what it meant. Stop cooking. Stop knocking on doors. Stop being the person 6 people expected at supper time. I wanted to argue, but Nora looked at me first. Maya, if she ignores it, they'll use that against her. Grandma folded her hands over the notebook. Then I won't give them that, she said. The call came that afternoon. A woman from senior services called that afternoon. Polite enough to make it worse, she said there had been a concern about informal meal distribution to vulnerable adults. Until Monday's review, Mrs. Whitaker was being asked to suspend all meal deliveries. She said suspend like it was a soft word. Grandma said, "I understand," thanked her, and hung up. Then she stood very still beside the wall phone. The kitchen had never felt quieter to me, not empty. Worse than empty, interrupted. That evening, the calls started. Cal first, Grandma let it ring, June next. Then Mildred, who never called unless something was wrong or she was pretending it wasn't. Each ring pulled something across Grandma's face and left it there. I said, "Let me take something over, just tonight." She shook her head. "If I break the rule the same day they call me unsafe, they win." There was no drama in her voice. She was not surrendering because she was weak. She was obeying because she understood how people like Grant turned small mistakes into final proof. The 6 insulated bags sat by the back door, empty and open, like mouths with nothing to say. I could not look at them for long. Then Tessa called. I stepped onto the porch before answering. "Grant says this is temporary," she said, trying to sound calm. "Once the contract passes, there'll be meals for everyone." I looked through the window at Grandma, sitting before the notebook she was not allowed to use. "Will they know Mildred can't eat onions?" I asked. Tessa went quiet, not offended, worse, blank. She didn't know who Mildred was. The next morning, a car door shut outside before breakfast. Cal stood on the porch in his winter coat, holding a SilverTray box against his chest like evidence he didn't know he was carrying. He looked embarrassed to be there. "I'm sorry," he said when I opened the door. I didn't know where else to go. Grandma rose slowly behind me. Cal lifted the box a little. "I tried," he said. "But I don't need perfect food, Evie. I need somebody who remembers I don't eat beef in February." For the first time, I understood Grant had built his whole argument around people he had never bothered to know. Cal stayed only long enough for Grandma to make him tea. He kept apologizing for showing up, and every time he did, Grandma said, "You came to the right door." Before he left, June knocked, then Mildred, then Walter. Each one carried a SilverTray box, or a complaint folded into embarrassment. None of them arrived angry. That was what hurt. They came like people asking permission to need something. June set her tray on the counter and said, "Maybe somebody can explain why low sodium tastes like a salt lick." Mildred tapped the ingredients label. "Onion powder. Right there. Hiding in tiny print." Walter did not bring food. He brought one of Grandma's napkins. It was folded into a small square and kept in his coat pocket. He smoothed it on the table like it meant something official. "This is what they don't understand," he said. It wasn't just dinner, it was proof somebody had come by. No one answered for a moment. Even Mildred stopped fussing with the label. Grandma looked down at her hands. I saw her fighting the old habit of making herself smaller whenever the room started to notice how much she had been carrying. I called Nora, but not to rescue us. I told her there were people in Grandma's kitchen who needed to be heard before Monday. She arrived 20 minutes later, pulled out a chair, and listened. Cal talked about February. June explained waking up thirsty. Mildred said customer service had told her allergies could be added in future updates, as if her body could wait for software. Walter said check-ins mattered more than portion sizes some nights. Nora did not interrupt or turn it into a meeting. She just listened until the kitchen stopped feeling like a complaint and started feeling like a record. When they finished, Nora opened Grandma's notebook again, slowly this time. "This isn't just informal cooking," she said. "It's a care map." Then she looked at Grandma, not at me. "But if we want the board to understand that, we can't pretend the safety concerns don't exist." Grandma nodded. "I know." Nora tapped the page. Then we build something they can't dismiss. A supervised community kitchen, volunteers, temperature logs, dietary notes, delivery records, your knowledge, but with support around it. She turned to me. Maya can help structure it, if you want her to. That last part changed the room. If you want her to. Grandma heard it too. Her shoulders dropped, just a little, like someone had finally stopped pulling on them. I don't want to be in charge of people, she said. I just don't want them forgotten. Nora smiled softly. Then that's the proposal. By noon, the kitchen table was covered with notes. June wrote what foods made her swell. Mildred underlined no onions 3 times. Walter listed neighbors who needed check-ins more than meals. The truth had not arrived as a document or confession. It had walked in, wearing winter coats, carrying unopened trays. For the first time since that frozen meal appeared on Grandma's birthday, the room felt warm. It didn't pretend everything was fixed. There was still a board meeting on Monday. Grant still had slides, numbers, and my sister's face beside his campaign. My parents still believed they could call control protection, if they said it calmly enough. But now Grandma had something they had not planned for, people who could speak for themselves. And if the board was going to hear them, one person still had to stop selling Grandma's story before Grant did. I texted Tessa after everyone left. Not a paragraph, not a speech, just one sentence. Ask Grant who Mildred is. For almost an hour, she didn't answer. I imagined her reading it in some Santa Fe hotel lobby, surrounded by white tablecloths and people using words like wellness without ever sitting beside someone afraid to eat the wrong soup. When my phone finally lit up, it was a call. I stepped onto the porch. I didn't want Grandma to have to hear whatever my sister had decided to defend. Tessa sounded different. No music behind her, no polished brightness. I asked him, she said. He thought Mildred was one of the board members. I closed my eyes, then she added, softer. When I told him she was one of Grandma's people, he said we can't build a program around every Mildred. Some sentences do not sound cruel until they land in the right room. That one landed on Grandma's notebook, on the unopened trays, on the words, no onions, written 3 times. Tessa did not need me to explain it. He keeps saying scalable, she said. Like people are dough. I leaned against the porch rail. Your campaign says every grandmother matters. I know. No, I said, quieter than I expected. You sold that line. Grandma lived it. She said nothing for a moment, then her breath shook. I looked at the deck again. There's a photo of her hands rolling pie crust under the slide about emotional trust. I thought it was beautiful. I didn't ask if it was fair. That was the first time Tessa sounded less like someone caught, and more like someone waking up. I wanted to forgive her right then, because I was tired, and because one less enemy would have felt like relief. But easy forgiveness can become another way of skipping the truth. What are you going to do? I asked. She gave a small, broken laugh. For once, not make a post. On Monday morning, Tessa walked into the community center in a gray sweater. She had no camera crew, no perfect smile. Grant stood near the projector with his slides ready. My parents sat beside him like quiet endorsers. On the screen behind him was Grandma's kitchen, softened with a warm filter it had never needed. Tessa looked at me once from across the room. Then, she turned her phone face down on the table and stepped away from Grant's side. The room had been arranged for a sales pitch, not a reckoning. Folding chairs faced a projector screen. A long table sat at the front for the board members, with nameplates, water bottles, and stacks of paper nobody had touched yet. Grant stood beside his laptop in a dark blazer, relaxed in the way men look relaxed when they believe the room already belongs to them. My father sat 2 rows back, arms crossed. My mother kept her purse on her lap like she might need to leave quickly if things became unpleasant. Grandma sat beside me near the aisle. Nora was on her other side with the notebook closed in front of her. It was not hidden or displayed. Cal, June, Mildred, and Walter had taken seats behind us. None of them looked like activists. They looked like people who had dressed carefully because they were afraid being ordinary would make them easier to dismiss. Tessa stood near the wall, no longer beside Grant, and I saw him notice that for the first time. His smile tightened, but he kept it. Grant began with numbers: cost per meal, delivery radius, packaging reliability, reduced liability. He spoke well, I could admit that. He did not sound cruel, he sounded certain. Older adults deserve dignity, he said, clicking to the next slide. And dignity starts with reliable systems. On the screen appeared a softened photo of Grandma's kitchen, the yellow light warmer than real life, the edges blurred into something marketable. My grandmother looked at it for one long second. Then she looked down at her hands. My father stood when public comments opened. "My mother is a wonderful woman," he said, using the voice he saved for clients and church banquets. But wonderful women can still take on too much. Our family has watched her struggle to accept help. I felt my hand close around the edge of my chair. Before I could speak, Grandma touched my wrist. She stood slowly, but without shaking. "I accept help," she said. "I don't accept being replaced without being asked." A few people shifted in their seats. Grant stepped forward, gentle and polished. "Mrs. Whitaker, no one is replacing you. We're trying to protect people from inconsistent care." Nora opened her folder then, not dramatically, just enough to place one page in front of the board chair. "There is another option," she said, "a supervised community kitchen. Volunteers, temperature logs, dietary notes, delivery records, Evelyn's knowledge, with support around it." My father frowned. "That still sounds like putting pressure on an 86-year-old woman." Grandma turned toward him, not angry. Worse for him than angry. Clear. "No, Raymond," she said. "It sounds like finally giving me help before taking away my purpose." Grant smiled like he could still smooth that sentence flat. Then June raised her hand from the second row. Her voice was small, but the room heard it. "Mr. Huxley," she asked, "if your system knows seniors so well, why did your low-sodium dinner make me thirsty all night?" Grant kept his smile, but it had lost its warmth. "June, I'm sorry that happened," he said. "Individual preferences can be adjusted as the program develops." Mildred lifted her hand before he finished. "Preference?" she said. "I have an allergy. Your tray had onion powder in it." A board member looked down at the sample ingredient sheet. Grant turned slightly toward his assistant, just enough for everyone to notice. "That information wasn't in our intake system yet," he said. Mildred leaned forward. "Evelyn knew it because I told her once in 1998. The room changed after that. Not loudly, people just stopped looking at the screen and started looking at the people in the chairs. Cal stood next, both hands on the back of the seat in front of him. "After my wife died," he said, "Evie brought soup every February. Not because soup fixes grief, because she remembered when I stopped eating beef." His voice caught, and he hated that it did. "Your system delivered me beef stew in February." Grant opened his mouth, but Cal shook his head. "I'm not mad about stew. I'm mad that you called it care." Nora slid Grandma's notebook toward the board chair. "This is the difference," she said. "Not sentiment. Information. Dietary needs. Grief dates. Mobility concerns. Check-in patterns. We can put safety around this without erasing the human part." Grant's jaw worked once. "With respect, we're discussing a public program, not personal favors." Walter laughed softly, without humor. "When you're old enough," he said, "personal is the program." A few people murmured. My mother looked down at her purse. My father stared straight ahead. If he did not move, none of this would touch him. Then I placed the SilverTray box on the table. It was the one Grandma had been left with on her birthday. I turned the label toward the board. "Trial meal 1 of 14. This was delivered before anyone asked her what she wanted," I said. Not after she agreed. Before. Grant looked at my father. That small glance did more than a denial could have. The board chair asked, "Mr. Huxley, do you have a signed consent form from Mrs. Whitaker for the trial?" Grant said, "We understood the family had discussed it, Grandma looked up. Then show them where I volunteered. He could not. Not then. Not in that room. Tessa stepped forward before my father could speak for him. I need to withdraw my testimonial from SilverTray's proposal, she said. Grant turned sharply. Tessa. She did not look at him. I used my grandmother's kitchen in a campaign before I asked her permission. I made her into a symbol before I asked what she wanted. My mother whispered, "Don't humiliate this family." Tessa looked at her and said, "We did that before I stood up." The board chair called for a 30-day review. SilverTray would not be approved that day. And my father, for once, had no room left to call control love. Grant left the community center before the board finished talking. He did not slam a door or make a scene. Men like him don't make a scene when they can still pretend they chose the exit. Tessa stayed behind. Her phone remained face down on the table, dark and useless for once. Later that afternoon, she removed Grandma's kitchen from the campaign page. A sponsor backed out by Tuesday. Grant called her twice, then texted that she had cost him a contract. She showed me the message, without asking me to be the one to fix it. "No," she typed back. "I stopped selling a story I didn't have permission to tell." SilverTray was not thrown out of town overnight. Real life does not move that cleanly. But the board delayed the vote and required written consent from everyone in the trial. When Grant could not produce Grandma's signature, his polished proposal lost the thing it had depended on most: trust. Nora helped create the 30-day community kitchen review. There would be volunteers with clipboards, delivery records, and food safety checks. Labels would be large enough for Mildred to read without a magnifier. Grandma would not cook alone anymore. She would advise, taste, correct, remember. My mother called 3 days later, after the hospital committee asked her to step back from a senior outreach fundraiser. "You let people think I don't care about her," she said. I was standing in Grandma's pantry, labeling jars with Nora's marker. "Mom," I said, "people watched you choose the version of caring that didn't require you to stay." She was quiet, then whispered, "I had a flight." I looked at the shelf, where the empty SilverTray tray sat, washed clean but not thrown away. "Grandma had a birthday," I said. For once, my mother had nothing smooth to put over that. Dad came the following Sunday with grocery store flowers. Grandma met him on the porch instead of waving him into the kitchen. I stayed inside, close enough to hear, far enough not to take over. "I was trying to keep you safe," he said. Grandma's voice was tired, but steady. "You were trying to keep me simple," he said. "You're 86, she answered. "Yes, not erased." Then she gave him the rule that changed our family more than any punishment could have. "If you want to help, you ask. If you want to decide for me, you go home." A month later, the Willow Spoon was not a diner again. It was something quieter and better suited to what remained. A community kitchen with scuffed floors, volunteer clipboards, and a stove Grandma still corrected everyone for using wrong. Tessa came on Saturdays without filming. The first time Mildred told her, "Onions. Everybody forgets onions," Tessa wrote it twice and said, "I won't." Grandma handed me her old wooden spoon that evening and smiled. "You didn't save me, Maya," she said. "You asked me what I wanted. I wished I had asked sooner," she said. "You asked in time." They left her a frozen meal because they thought old age meant accepting less. But my grandmother taught me that growing older does not mean disappearing. Sometimes a warm meal is not just food. Sometimes it is the last, steady way a person says, "I am still here." What this story taught me is that love is not always loud. Sometimes love is a bowl of soup carried across town before dark. Sometimes it is remembering that someone cannot eat onions, or that February still hurts because a wife is gone, or that a porch light left off might mean someone is too tired to ask for help. And sometimes, the people who talk the most about protecting you are the ones taking choices away from you. My grandmother did not need to be rescued like a helpless woman. She needed to be heard like a person who still knew her own life. That was the lesson I almost missed. I was so angry at my parents for deciding for her that I nearly started deciding for her too. I wanted to fight for her before I stopped to ask what she wanted the fight to be. Family can become dangerous when love turns into control. It can happen quietly. A decision made for your own good. A meal chosen without asking. A room entered without knocking. A life reduced to safety, convenience, and what makes everyone else comfortable. But dignity is not the same as comfort, and caring for someone does not mean making them smaller. My grandmother's strength was not in proving everyone wrong with one big speech. It was in staying steady, in knowing the names, in refusing to disappear, just because others were ready to file her into the category of old, difficult, or done. She reminded me that growing older does not erase purpose. It only changes the way purpose has to be protected. The deepest kind of love asks before it acts. It listens before it fixes. It helps without taking over. And when someone you love is aging, the question should never be, how do we make this easier for us? It should be, what still matters to you? Because sometimes a warm meal is not just food. Sometimes it is memory, dignity, and proof that someone is still here. Have you ever watched someone's kindness be mistaken for weakness?